sociologist and political scientist and work in Linz, Austria at the university, but live in Berlin and spent very much of, well, more than half of the last 20 years in different countries in Latin America, working there. I'm trying to set up some dia show, but it's all in Greek, so yeah. I will just run a few pictures in the back and sometimes say something about them, but it's mainly about different recuperated factories, so factories occupied by workers in order to produce, or enterprises, companies, not even only factories. So sometimes I will say something about the pictures, otherwise you have them just in the back. Okay, the subject I'll be talking about is workplace recuperations occupations in order to produce, and I will refer to them as recuperated factories. Why is it in any way interesting or relevant? It is because, I mean, you all know probably about Viome, the occupied and producing factory here in Greece, in Thessaloniki, but there are also a few others that came up in Europe during the last years of, most recent years of crisis, where they usually, and nobody knows about that. Usually everyone refers to, this is not moving, is it? No. Refers to Argentina when thinking about recuperated factories. In fact, it started there, or it got big and known with the crisis around 2000, 2001, and there are today about 350, 360 recuperated workplaces in Argentina. What very few people know is that there are also about 70 in Brazil, about 24 in Uruguay, something between 70 and 100 in Venezuela, and then a few single ones that are sprinkled over Latin America, but also in Indonesia, in India, and some other countries where these recuperations have been done by workers during the late years and during the crisis. Why is that in any way interesting or relevant, or maybe let's start, why don't we know anything about it? Because it's exactly a kind of worker self-organization where really no one is interested in talking about it or making it known. The traditional institutions that claim to represent workers don't usually, apart from a very few cases, really support or even less make these experiences known, because they would automatically question their own representation role, because these workers that organize themselves to occupy companies don't need obviously any representation in the traditional form, nor by parties, nor by unions. So they question one of the principles that unions and parties are built upon. So we don't read about that. And in fact, in history, we can see, because it's not a novelty, I mean, throughout history, throughout the last 150 years, workers have always occupied their workplaces in any kind of crisis, be it a political crisis, be it economic crisis, social crisis, legitimation crisis, whatever. They have been taken over and producing in their own companies under workers' control in socialist revolutions, but also in democratic revolutions, in anti-colonial struggles, in capitalist crisis like in the early 80s, in political crisis, or in economic crisis like now. Nevertheless, even if it seems to be an inherent tendency of working people, of workers, to come together in a collective way, take over, and produce under their control, even so, this is, there's very little, let's say, knowledge or information about that. And I think it has been done over the last 135, 150 years, more or less, and even without knowledge of occupations before. So the workers don't take over their company because they say, okay, the workers have done it in a socialist revolution, have done it there and there, we read that, so we also take it over. They take it over because they get together and they have a collective process. So I think it's very important to see that if we talk about factory or company recuperations, we're not talking about a merely economic, and mainly not even mainly economic process, but about a social process. And I think that every worker that has been in a factory recuperation can confirm how these recuperations change not only the workplace, not only the workers, and not only the relationships to customers and to communities, they change everything. So in this kind of process. So I think it's interesting that the big difference between today or contemporary recuperations and the ones I cited historically, one difference is obvious. Most of the times these recuperations happened in times of labor or leftist offensive. Now it's out of a totally defensive situation. But that's one of the interesting things about, like these new recuperations, even the last years, and there have been like around 50, 60 in Argentina during this crisis, but also definitely 2 in France, 2 in Italy, Viome here, and a lot of more examples where it's not that clear, the struggle, but it's also some kind of takeover. But they're all out of a defensive situation. It's workers that don't have a choice, that are there to not only lose their jobs, but they also have very little chances to expect any new job, any other job. So that's definitely a huge difference, but at the same time, if we look around in a situation where unions are usually not able anymore to lead any offensive struggles. Most of the times they don't even win the defensive struggles or don't even go into them. In this situation where practically the whole traditional workers' representation does not work anymore to win something, to gain something, to show something that could be an alternative to the existing, these workplace recuperations are an offensive struggle. The workers are not passive anymore. They're not just begging for something or expecting something that should be gifted to them. They're taking over and they're producing. And that's, I think, a very, very important thing to look at. Even if it's just a few small examples until now in Europe, it's very important to see what role these examples can play and play. For example, the whole recuperations in Argentina, and what we see here is Chilaver, it's a print shop in Buenos Aires. That's another small ironworks shops in Buenos Aires. That's a hotel. So we see it's not about just factories. It's all kind of companies. And one very interesting thing about the latest recuperations in Argentina is that they started skipping sectors. That's another print shop in Cordoba, in Argentina. That's Venezuela. That's a cocoa processing plant in Venezuela. But what we see is that in these new recuperations in Argentina, for example, we have a lot of places in the service sector, restaurants, and even, we'll have some pictures later, and even some fast food restaurants that have been occupied and recuperated and are working now under workers' control. So we can see it's not just about a certain sector, it's just about industrial work, it's about a reappropriation of work. One could ask, all these that's a ketchup tomato factory in Venezuela, we could ask and think, so these recuperations, I think that apart from giving back the possibility of going into an offensive struggle, of creating new social processes, because these factories obviously don't survive on their own. They cannot trust obviously not the capitalists, most of the times not even the government, and not even unions, etc. So they rely on their own, and they rely on the new alliances and networks they form. So we can see that a lot of these factories are connected to other movements, are connected to other social movements, have a strong, strong connection to the community where they are. So most of these factories open up the factories for some kind of regular community activities or activities with the community, with other movements, etc. And it's interesting because If we heard it before and we read it a lot of times that what change is going to come in the big cities and the metropolis and the urban areas. Everybody's talking about the urban areas. Everybody's talking about labor, about commons in urban areas. But at the same time, most of the commons in urban areas we talk about are not connected to production. And if they are, it's usually a small focus on digital or immaterial production. Obviously, the role of immaterial production compared to material production has grown during the last decades, but nevertheless, we will not be able to live without material production. So I think that the question of how can material production be understood as labor as commons is totally central, especially in urban areas. And I think that these workplace recuperations are an example of how we can think about labor as commons. And this is also a huge difference between the traditional cooperatives and these recuperations, even if almost all recuperations end up with the juridical form of a cooperative. There is no other juridical form for any collective administration of companies, so that's why they end up there. But there's a big difference. First of all, there's a difference that the workers of a recuperated workplace don't think that their right to decide about the workplace comes from the notion of property, which is still a strong characteristic of cooperatives. They think it comes from the notion from the right to work and from the right that they have the right to work in this place because they've been working there before and so they contributed to it to build it up. They think that the right to be there and to produce comes from a connection that they produce for the people and for the communities. And we can see how the relation to the product is changing in this production process. And if we go back to Europe, I mean, we will hear more about it. We have the comrades from Fralip, the former Unilever and Lipton tea plant close to Marseille, who are now, after a 1,350-something day struggle, have managed to force Unilever to pay them a lot to hand them over most of the machines and the factory, and they're now producing, and that's interesting, different kinds of, like, I think 16 different types of organic teas, mostly local, but also in connection with, I think, a workers' cooperative in Vietnam. So it changed totally from like industrial process tea. They're now embedded into a network of a regional organic solidarity economy, but also with ties going much further to other continents. And the interesting thing is also that these factories create networks. So this is Uruguay. This is one of the fast food shops in Buenos Aires that is now under workers' control. This is a mill that was occupied recently. This is Viome. This is Fralip. But with the help of researchers and solidarity of other people and of workers from different factories, they have been setting up regional and worldwide meetings where there is an exchange of experiences, of ideas about how a workers' economy could be, what's the difference. They're taking place now every 2 years in Latin America. They had 7 already. We had the first one in Europe 2 years ago. We're going to have next one in March in Viome next year. And people are preparing one in Asia. And then there's every 2 years, alternating with these regional meetings, there is a worldwide meeting that took place in Venezuela this year. This is one of the Italian factories, Rimaflow. This is the other one, Officine Zero in Rome. Viome again. Yeah. So we see this is the meeting in Fralip we had 2 years ago. This is the meeting in Venezuela this summer. And these networks help, obviously, to exchange experiences, to production experiences, collective experiences, etc., and show again how this strong connection between social process and economic process is there. So now I think that what is absolutely important in this in this context is that even we have just a few examples, but it's interesting how obviously it becomes thinkable. If we see an occupation, if something like that happens and the VMA workers can tell how many workers from different workplaces went there, to ask them about their experiences and at least consider to have an occupation. So it's coming to an end. That's one collection I published. That's a more recent one I published about workers' control, because I think it's important to make these experiences available to all kinds of workers. And so there's also Workers' Control Net, multilingual website archive we founded between workers and researchers to make these experiences available. So I'm closing now with what has to be done. And what has to be done is obviously at this moment defend VMA, because they scheduled an auction for the 25th of November to sell the land where VMA is on. The government is not intervening. No one is intervening until now. That would mean the end of the VMA experience, but the workers are obviously not, don't accept this, so they will fight to defend VMA, and I call everyone to stand with VMA, because these recuperations represent a real alternative to what we live now, even if it's just a process. Thank you.